Welcome everyone to our presentation on Spirit Eye Cave in Presidio County, Texas. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Bryon Schroeder. Dr. Schroeder received his doctorate in anthropology from the University of Montana in 2015, where he focused on high altitude hunter-gatherer sites in the Wind River Range of the Middle Rocky Mountains. Today, he is the director of the Center for Big Bend Studies at Sul Ross University, where his research interests include collector collaboration, ancient human and plant DNA, and the distribution of ancient maize. He is currently conducting excavations at several of the large rock shelters and caves in the Big Bend region. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Schroeder.
Well, thank you, Drew. Today, I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing since 2017 on this large cave system that's known as Spirit Eye Cave. And I'll kind of go through some of the history, location, and the findings that we've been able to uncover at this large cave system. The cave gets its name from these double openings that you can see here in this bottom image. It's located near Rio Grande, Texas, and it's got a very long history of human occupation in it, but also human collecting with it, which has kind of left a lot of professionals uninterested in researching it. And I'll go through more of that as we go along. But here are some of the locational information here. And you can see those lower and upper entrances here. This slide is just giving you this is a 3D ground-based LiDAR image of the cave. One of the things we've done with our work at this cave is do ground-based LiDAR imaging at it. This is a 2D representation of a three-dimensional image. All of the green is open area and all the black is solid rock. And I'll go through everything that we've excavated and what we've done, but this is the cave system, and the main chamber is where a lot of the information I'll talk about has happened. In the main chamber is this U-shaped thing that you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen. So one of the most striking aspects of it is just the sheer amount of destruction that's happened into it. Like I said at the beginning, this cave is not pristine in any sense of the word. It's been heavily altered by years of collecting, and some of that was pay to dig. The current landowner was really interested in having new research happen at the site, but a lot of professionals have kind of avoided it because, as you see here, there's just a tremendous amount of excavation that happened at it. At the upper entrance, there's a large back dirt pile where a group screened inside the cave, and then the whole interior chamber of it is cratered from years of excavation. People have dug so much at the site that they actually dug through the bedrock. So it's pretty hard to wrap your head around exactly what happened, but it's very clear that you're not walking into the site as a pristine site. So I really wanted to do research at a cave just because of how much of the archaeological record that they preserve. And kind of one of the things that I sought out when I started this work was other caves or other sites where people have sort of grappled with the same problem. Like, how do you conduct research at these archaeology sites? They're obviously prominent sites on the landscape. They were major sites in prehistory, but they've been severely impacted by collecting. And there are examples in the archaeology of modern archaeologists working at these. Ceremonial Cave, they've done a lot of dating with the atlatls and the foreshafts. Promontory caves on the shore of Salt Lake are probably one of the most interesting things done with a cave system that's been really heavily collected. But you can do stuff with this. So I sort of looked at these examples and came up with kind of a working research idea. And then in 2017, when I originally started this work, I was sort of motivated by this quote from colleagues at the University of Wyoming who challenge us that the next generation of archaeologists will find themselves working in completely different environments than this generation, where we're going to actually have to reinvestigate sites. And so I took this more as a challenge. Let's do some research at the site because it's such a prominent place. And my guiding question through all of this is, when do artifacts and sites become unworthy of research? I thought maybe there was a way that we could quantify that, or maybe if we thought about research in less conventional means, not necessarily digging square holes and finding stuff, but knowing that this cave was the source of a lot of archaeological material, starting there and then working outwards, I thought this would be a really important, this might be a really important question to kind of rethink how we approach these heavily looted sites. So the first thing that I wanted to do was just see if I could tackle some of the history. And I originally thought doing this work that the contribution, I originally didn't think I would track down any artifacts. I originally thought, or history, I thought really what we would do is maybe come up with a behavioral signature of collecting, or like do more of a modern ethnography or on modern collectors. And I really thought that that's kind of what we could do at the site. But the El Paso Archaeological Society got really involved in this site in the 60s. And this is where a plug for folks in Texas to get trinomials really comes in, because it was the El Paso Archaeological Society getting the trinomial, which is the Smithsonian number that's assigned to the site. And as you see, it's broken down in the upper right-hand corner, that really, really started this dramatic period of collecting. Through that trinomial, I was able to track down tons of names that just kept getting me more and more information. So much so that I can come up with 7 big periods of artifact collecting on this site that begins with a letter from Frank Setzler to Neil Judd. Neil Judd went on to dig Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon. And Neil Judd was actually going to come down and dig a large cave on Pinto Canyon, but went and dug Pueblo Bonito instead. Letters to the USDA and Frank Setzler saying, hey, there's somebody talking about a really big cave down on Pinto Canyon that we need to go investigate. And I guess I can't be definitive that it was this cave, but this is a really big cave down on Pinto Canyon. So I tentatively put that as the first chapter. And they said that they were finding lots of baskets and lots of textiles, but they didn't find any pottery, so they weren't that interested in it. Then there's this chapter in the 1950s where there's actually a student writes a term paper on his family collecting child burials from the site in the 1950s. And they can tie that back to the double opening. That's the big thing about this cave that makes it really easy to tie a lot of these stories back. These double openings that sort of look like 2 eyes really left an impression on a lot of people, and really made it easy to tie a lot of these letters back to them. The next biggest chapter of collecting is in the early 1960s, and there's kind of letters that go along with this group of collectors that went down to this, and they exhumed the body of an adult male, a flexed burial. And then from 1965 to 1968, the cave enters a really big pay to dig, where the landowner would charge $2 a head for folks to come down and dig the site. And then that's how EPAS gets involved in the 60s. And then you have another landowner who gets involved in the 1970s and actually leads what he calls the Briscoe Newkirk expedition down to the shelter and excavates down there. And then you sort of get the end of collecting down there, and then you get the redistribution of the materials. So in 1968, Ben Key, who was a part of that 1968 expedition, sells the remains that they took out to a buyer in California, and that'll come back, and I'll go through that a little bit more. And then in the 90s, during a very bizarre game and fish bust, the game and fish was going to the buyer's house in California who had bought the remains from this cave, and they had no idea that they were going to be human remains. They were actually there to bust the individual for trafficking exotic species, and there was a mummified set of remains in his living room, and they called the coroner and got the coroner out, and it was through a series of events that those remains ended up back in Texas. And then in the 2000s, somebody actually excavated the sites, and this is the one I don't know much about, but there was the case where federal agents did a big sting on collectors in Blanding, Utah, and when they did that big sting, they found a bunch of photos of those individuals digging out at this cave. So they had done some time down here excavating in addition to Blanding, Utah, and that's the one that I have photos of, but I don't know exactly where those artifacts are. And it wasn't until 2002 that the first professional visited the site, and then in 2006 that there's a little bit of traction with there became a myth of the Chinati Mountain mummies that got posted on a blog. So this site has always been kind of in the background since the 20s, but people have always known about it, but there hasn't been any real professional involvement in it. So that's kind of a whirlwind history of it. And I'll go into a little bit more detail because I think it's worth showing how this history got me to where I am with the results. So by far the longest chapter on this site was it's called the Claybaugh expedition, and Claybaugh and Novak were the two excavators of the site. And I will say that they tried forever to get professionals involved in this site. They wrote letters to UT Austin constantly from 1920 through 1968. And they really, really, really wanted help. And then in 68, they really, really tried again to get everybody involved with this. But the construction of Amistad Reservoir had really shifted all of the professionals to one place. So there's a ton of letters that get written about this period. And essentially what happens is everybody said that they couldn't come out and help them, and the El Paso Archaeological Society ends up coming out helping them in the 60s. And the El Paso Archaeological Society actually came out in December of 1968, mobilized through these Campbell letters, and they photographed the collection. They did a really good excavation. They took really good notes, but unfortunately those notes weren't stored that well, so they're really difficult to read. And I mean, it's worth noting at this time in the 60s, there were professionals that weren't digging as controlled as the El Paso Archaeological Society. So they really did do a good job. They signed in at the Chinati Hot Springs, and they actually had a roster of everybody who was involved on that excavation, and along with the name in the bottom of this slide of the landowner that they paid to excavate the site. They also did some of the pay to dig, but they took those artifacts. And I've contacted everybody who is alive on this. Well, I talked to Evans about this when Evans was alive, but he didn't remember finding much. He didn't really remember much about the excavation other than having to lug the generator up the hill to light the excavation. So this is where I actually acquired the first artifacts. So after I sort of uncovered the history, I reached out to the El Paso Archaeological Society, and the El Paso Archaeological Society donated their collection to Sul Ross State University. And we've gone through it, and we now have 2,200 artifacts from them. And I recently just got the photographs of their excavation, and I'm now able to tie it into the units that they dug. So this is the first thing that this is the first work that I can actually tie the artifacts back to the cave. That Chinati Mountain expedition did something really, really important for the site. They photographed Mr. Novak's collection, and what's on the left. And I was motivated enough to call every Novak in West Texas, and I found him in 2017, and I was able to photograph the same collection that they photographed in 1968. It still exists today. It's in the exact same Riker mount. It's glued the exact same way to the felt paper, and I've been working with him now, and some of the results that we'll go through are because of the work that the El Paso Archaeology Society did in 1968. The second big excavation that happened was what's called the Pecos expedition, and I can't find their artifacts from their time there, but I've been able to find the remains that the human remains that they had this time. But they have a few photos, and I'm able to tie their photos with their expedition. So I was able to tie this work back to the cave. So anything that comes from this time period, I'm pretty confident came to the cave. The picture on the left actually isn't a picture of the cave. It's a picture of where you park before you enter the cave. And so that was pretty integral, that anything that I could associate with this time period, I could associate this back to the cave. So it wasn't until 2016 that we went out and did the first professional excavation. And kind of after tracking down that history, I came up with a plan to kind of figure out where and if there was anything left inside this cave. And the first work I did, if we go back to that beginning entrance, was at the upper entrance. So that's that yellow block. I did a fairly big block excavation up there in a big mound of dirt that was obvious it was a back dirt pile from somebody excavating, but I thought maybe they had, with all that excavating up front, I thought maybe that they had capped some intact stuff up there. So that's the first thing we did. And in 2017, we found 20,000 artifacts up front, and we found a really big exposure, almost 2 meters tall. And you can see series after series of screening in the upper stuff. And then when you get in kind of the middle section of the big mound, it gets a little bit harder to see. One of the interesting things is we found an articulated burrow skeleton, totally articulated. It had a set of wood poles over the top of it that we thought was the pack frame, but now I think it's actually debris associated with the 1960s El Paso excavation. But we were able to uncover a pretty good assemblage of perishable artifacts. This is all out of the back dirt. We found the first pottery. Nobody had ever reported pottery from the site. And now we have several pieces of different Puebloan style wares. We have a little bit of Casas Grandes pottery at the site, and we have a little bit of Jornada Mogollon pottery at the site. So the next big work that we did at the site was we did a bunch of trenching up front because it was very obvious that the blocks weren't intact. So we did a big, what we call the hand trench 1 up front. We just dug this thing out, and then we dug in the back of shaft B. So shaft B is that kind of long thing right below the ground-based LiDAR, and then the hand trench 1 is kind of up front. And in shaft B, we found intact deposits. So we found an area of the shelter that had never been excavated. And this stuff hasn't been dated yet. This is on the to-do list, but we found a net fragment. We found an upper small hearth where they were burning corn, but we did really, really limited small excavations in this just to see if we could find intact stuff. So we had a little bit of intact stuff up front, or in the back, sorry, shaft B. And then up front, so this is, if you look at this kind of profile, there we dug a huge hand trench. You can see the line of the inside of the cave on the left there. There's almost 4 feet of screened backfill over the top of an intact surface. So if you look at the figure in the top image, if you look at the individual's knees, everything below that is actually intact. And that level is only about 500 years old. So that's the ground surface that people would have been on using the cave, and everything else has been pulled out of the cave during the excavations. So a significant amount of collecting has happened at the site, but digging outside of the shelter has never happened by professionals. So we know we have everything that happened outside of the cave is intact. So my first 2 years of work were really focused on this, just trying to figure out where stuff was left in the shelter, if there was anything left and what we could do, and then attach it to that history I just talked about. And one of the things that came out of all of this work is we uncovered an incredible amount of projectile points. No one was ever collecting the projectile points. None of the collectors I have very many projectile points from the sites. And one of the things that became obvious is that this cave wasn't being excavated for the stone. It was being excavated for the perishable technology that was left in it. Every collector I talked to had no interest in the stone technology. They all wanted this perishable stuff. And they all said that it was known as the best perishable cave in West Texas. So after the first 2 years of research, we were able to basically find 2 fairly small but significant portions of the cave that had not been impacted by collecting, and they're seen here in the white. So we found different occupational zones in shaft B and a little bit in shaft A, and then we found a big kind of earth oven in the front of the shelter that hadn't been altered. So from all that, I'll quickly go through what we had found in those intact portions, and then what I've been able to do with the history. And one of the interesting things the first thing that we found is there's this idea out here in West Texas called El Despoblado. And that doesn't pertain specifically to sheltered sites, but there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of early human occupation out here. So and none of the shelters that have been dug prior have any material that's older than 5,000 years. So a big question was, could this cave contain deposits that have that early human record, or is it what Dr. John Seebach called the El Despoblado, that nobody was out here? And that question is really predicated for me on, is there dirt in this cave that dates to Paleo-Indian time period? So this graph is basically showing you that the orange line are dates out of rock shelters, and there are no really early dates out of rock shelters. Their blue line is showing you radiocarbon dates in open air sites. So we know that they're here, but they don't seem to be in rock shelters. So when we did this ground-based LiDAR map, we put in control points to kind of tie this thing back to reality, so we could make this map have a reference point in the planet. And when we did that, I hit a fiber bed, and I asked around what folks thought that fiber bed was, and it didn't take long until I found Jim Mead at the Mammoth site, who thought that it was dung of some type. So I sent it away for a date, and I got this 13,000-year-old date off of it. We dated the top and the bottom of this fiber level, and we knew that we had 13,000-year-old deposits in this cave. So the potential for early human stuff to be in this cave existed because we had an early date. Jim Mead came down last year, and we looked around for more of this fiber level, and we honestly couldn't find it. Somehow I hit it with one small little 20-centimeter test the first year. And so we spent a couple of days, and we ended up finding another location of it in Shaft A, and we found more of it. And he's a dung expert, and what he ended up determining that it was ground sloth dung, and this cave preserves ground sloth dung. There's much more of it in Shaft A, and the stuff that we found in Shaft A is actually 31,000 years old. And we've now done phytoliths on this, so we've looked at the plants that these are contained in this. And what's interesting is that we have keynote species of the Chihuahuan Desert in this sloth dung. So pack rat middens are typically done to look at environmental signatures from these caves. They can really give you a really glimpse into the pollen record of what's going on. And all the pollen record that's been done from pack rat middens during this time have not shown any evidence of the keynote species of the Chihuahuan Desert. But the sloth dung has creosote in it. So we have some of those species that are typifying the Chihuahuan Desert at 31,000 years. So we're going to do more with this, but right now we know that this cave has the potential to contain early human occupation. Right now it doesn't have anything that's associated with that time period, but it's got deposits that date to that time period, especially that 13,000-year-old stuff. The next big finding that came out of reconnecting everything with it is I reconnected with Chip Briscoe, who gave me his father's collection and notes from the Briscoe Newkirk expedition. He gave me this box of corn that came from the shelter, and I decided I would pick 5 pieces out of there, and we'd get some radiocarbon dates from it. We'd see how old this stuff was. And I assumed, to kind of backtrack here, I assumed that it would probably associated with this, like everyone did, that this maize use was really associated with the first villages down in the confluence of the Rio Grande and the Rio Conchos at La Junta. And so this kind of Puebloan period, like Pueblo IV expression period, pottery use, permanent houses. I thought the oldest this will be, 800 years old, associated with this period of indigenous occupation down here. And the popular thinking was that if there was any maize used any earlier, it was really limited. As you can see in this quote, everybody thought that maybe there was a little bit of early maize use in springs or along drainages or something like that, but there's not anything really older than that. Well, the radiocarbon dates came back that all of the maize dated to the late Archaic period. And what's more interesting is that this time period is the end of the early agricultural period across the greater Southwest area. So this maize that's being used at Spirit Eye is part of this big American Southwest picture. And now that we know that there's early maize here, part of what I've wanted to do from the work at Spirit Eye is expand this dating and find out how big this pattern is. I don't think it's restricted just to Spirit Eye, but what's interesting is I've dated 25 pieces of maize from other sites, and it's much easier to date old corn in the Big Bend region than it is to date 800-year-old corn. There's just not that much of it. This 2,000-year-old corn is much easier to find. So we're kind of at the beginning of understanding what that is, but it kind of gets into this really interesting time period, and I'll give a little background on what the early agricultural period is. It's really from the Tucson Basin in Arizona. And in that area, you have corn emerging in these groups that have this whole bunch of different ecotones. So they have fir forest, they have ponderosa forest, they have oak, they have all these ecotones stacked on each other, but all these stacked within a really tight period. The only other real work that's been done on maize in the Trans-Pecos comes from the Lower Pecos, where it just doesn't work. We know that there isn't maize in that part of the world. Phil Daring has written on this extensively, showing that it can't work because you just don't have that environmental diversity. So 3 conditions are thought to be needed. You need predictable rainfall. And if you look at the eastern trends, if you look at the Lower Pecos canyonlands and the east edge of the Trans-Pecos region, they don't have the predictable rainfall, they don't have the biotic diversity, and they don't have landforms associated with it. And I think that with the amount of work that's happened there, we sort of just assumed that, well, we don't have that either in this portion of the Big Bend region. But we're much more similar to this portion of the Trans-Pecos. This Big Bend portion of the Trans-Pecos is much more similar to the Arizona-Tucson Basin than the Lower Pecos region. We have everything you see here. We have the same amount of pine oak montane. We have the pinyon juniper uplands. We have desert grassland. We have the desert Chihuahuan scrub. So I think we have the necessary conditions for that early agricultural period to take root here. And the dates from Spirit Eye Cave show us that we have it. Now we need to make sure that we have more. So the findings from this one cave alone have been really, really interesting as far as they get as this larger early agricultural period. And if you look, this map is showing you a distribution of all of the dates that are basically the same time period across the American Southwest. So everything in red is outside of this area. It is a 2,000-year-old date or older. And then our 2,000-year-old dates that we're getting down here, first with Spirit Eye, and then I've sort of expanded it to 2 other sites, are in the green. So there's a much more dramatic period of early cultigen use down here that Spirit Eye has been very instrumental in helping us understand. And I think this will change, but I've kind of projected that maybe there's 2 initial uses of it. Maybe there's an early use associated with that larger early agricultural period, and then maybe there's a later use associated with those Pueblo groups. But we only have 20 to 25 pieces dated right now, so it'll be interesting to see if this pattern persists through with more dating and more work at Spirit Eye. So what really, really got me interested in this cave were the perishables. And without getting too in the weeds here, I'm really interested in perishable technologies because everything here, like you see the sandal, these are sandals here, and the baskets you see here. I'm really interested in those kind of things because they're what's called additive technology. And if you really want to get into looking at how things change in prehistory, or you really want to look at really tight-knit cultural groups. Additive technologies are much better to do that because they're really hard to learn and they're much more conservative. They don't change. Where you look at something like flint knapping, you're reducing something and it's harder to produce exactly what you learn because there's all these variables. The stone's breaking and it doesn't break exactly like you want it to break, so you kind of make do. Well, with additive stuff, we're actually adding to like pottery and those baskets. You're building exactly what you were taught. So there's much more of a replication for what you're learning there. So I'm interested if that gets us into the spread of ideas or people or both. And I think you can do that much better with additive technologies like these baskets. So one of the big baskets that came up is this basket in the upper left-hand corner. That's a closed coil basket, and a closed coil basket very similar to that was found in Cowboy Cave in Utah, dated to 9,000 years old. And when I sent a picture of this basket out to individuals that study this stuff, they thought, man, you really need to date that thing because it looks exactly like the basket that came out of Cowboy Cave. We dated it here and it came out to be about 2,000 years old, but the construction of this thing is incredibly similar. So now we have to start grappling with, is there a basket technology that kind of persists in this part of the world because if it's an idea or because it's just a really good technology? So that I admittedly want to do more with that, but we're just now getting down that road. What's really interesting is that I have a lot of these closed coil baskets from Spirit Eye, and then I have one of these baskets in the lower right-hand corner. This thing is probably watertight without any pitch on it, just of how tightly it's woven. It might have some mud in it. It's a bundle rod basket where they rather than getting a coil that they pull the various pieces through. They build it on they bundle a bunch of grass together and then stitch around that. That thing is almost 5,000 years old. It's about 4,500 years old. And it's the oldest artifact I have out of Spirit Eye. And it's obviously different manufacture than the stuff that comes later, the 2,000-year-old baskets. So like I said, I'm kind of at the beginning of doing this, but tracking these down and then dating them has been kind of the main goal. So there's going to be some really interesting stuff that happens there. The other thing that really I didn't expect to find from this was the insight into perishable weaponry. We have the stone parts, we get a lot of those. I knew from other sites down here that there were atlatl pieces, but if you kind of do an inventory of how many atlatls are known from North America, there's about 61. That can fluctuate. There's some counts that are higher, some are lower, but there's about, there's a mid 60s amount of atlatl pieces that are left that exist in the world from North America. And 3 of them are from Spirit Eye Cave. This piece from the lower left is from Spirit Eye Cave. And what's really interesting is that it looks exactly like an atlatl that was recovered from White Dog Cave in northeast Arizona. Kidder dug this site, and it gets its namesake from the desiccated dogs that date to 400 BC that were recovered from this cave. And here on the bottom image, you'll see that's a replica that Devin Pettigrew, a PhD student at UC Boulder, did of the White Dog atlatl. And the upper right image is from Spirit Eye Cave. And if you hold these two over the top of one another, they're almost made on a mold. They're almost the exact same size. They're the exact same technology, which is really interesting. And I got to date this atlatl, and it dates to, it's about 100 years younger than the maize that's been coming out of Spirit Eye Cave. And what's interesting is if you look through the literature, this is called the basket maker style atlatl. And the basket maker style atlatl has kind of a widespread distribution. There's an example found in the Shumla Cave over in Lower Pecos. That's what was recovered from Ceremonial Cave in New Mexico. And then that's what's covered from Spring Creek Cave up in Wyoming. And it's not, this is a type of weaponry that seems to be more lightweight than other atlatls. So when people say basket maker style atlatl, it just means kind of a lightweight atlatl technology. And we seem to know much more about this type than other type of atlatls. So what this is showing is there's some real diversity to this weaponry, and you know, when we track down these examples, we can learn more. But this is one of the few dates we've been able to get on these, and it was from Spirit Eye Cave. And the last thing that I've been able to do with some of my work here is actually track down the actual population. So 4 burials came out of this, and they're in private collections. One's in a private collection and one's at UT Austin. And one of the things I wanted to do was sample these collections and do DNA, and then open up a dialogue with what the next steps are with them. And I was able to do that with burial 3 and burial 4. Burial 3 was the one that was trafficked to a buyer in California, and it was placed in an ad in the back of a shotgun magazine and sold for $4,500, and through a very long and weird turn of events ends up back in Texas in 1998, I believe. But I was able to track these down, and we know that these came from there because of the letters. And we were able to do the first DNA on them, and we got radiocarbon dates from them. They're young. They're both younger than anything that's been recovered from the cave. Everything from the cave seems to be about 2,000 years old that I dated. These burials are about 900 years old and 700, depending on how radiocarbon dating works. There's either 220 or 55 years between these two deaths. But for our purposes, what's interesting is that there's at least a generation, maybe several, between the burial of these two individuals. And what's more interesting is both of the individuals share a matriline. This graph in the upper right is kind of difficult to interpret, but each line represents a mutation in the haplogroup, so in the genetic code from Spirit Eye. So Spirit Eye is in green, and then each individual off of it shares a mutation from Spirit Eye. So if you look on the chart on the left, we have living indigenous populations that still live in Mexico that are related to them. Most closely is the Atomi, and they live down in the state of Hidalgo. And we have one example of this haplogroup that's shown in Spirit Eye showing up at Pacame, which is a big site down in Mexico, a big Pueblo and site down in Mexico. So this haplogroup that shows up is showing up in living indigenous populations in Mexico and in the large Pueblo site of Pacame. And all my interpretation, our current interpretation of what happened with this is, even though we didn't get to dig these burials, is that at some point, some group related to these indigenous groups used this cave as a burial cave for generations, because these two individuals are in the same maternal line. So kind of bringing this all home, the work has been pretty daunting, beginning with just going there and wrapping your head around it. But we've been able to do quite a bit through the work with collections. We've been able to figure out that there's at least 4,000 years of human occupation. But the work that I've done at the intact portion suggests that there's a substantial late prehistoric occupation, and that the cave has the potential to preserve early Paleo-Indian deposits, but they just might not be there. If you look at just the perishable technology alone, they suggest the dates overlap so much that there's a window of 43 years when all of the perishable technologies have been coming back. So I'd like to keep blowing the radiocarbon dates up and refining that and see, we might have a very limited occupation during one time period in the Big Bend out here that really could be tremendous. But the big take home for me is although the initial work at this site wasn't very conventional, we're going to be able to reassemble a good portion of the occupational history of this cave, starting with the transition from the Pleistocene all the way through the Holocene. And I was able to do that through using a blend of communicating with avocational groups and the people who excavated this cave and tried very hard to work with archaeologists and ongoing field work. And the blend of those two have proven that this cave has quite a bit left to offer the science.
All right, well, thank you very much, Bryon. I do have a few questions if you have a moment.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned that a lot of the projectile points were recovered, I guess, from the back dirt piles.
Yeah.
But you seem to suggest that you do have intact deposits within the shelter. And I'm curious if you were finding any projectile points within those intact deposits that can help refine the chronology of the Big Bend region.
Yeah, so the stuff that's intact, I haven't been out there to do anything with it yet, but there's a really nice late prehistoric layer. It's got a lot of arrow points in it. So there's definitely going to be a good arrow point layer, and I just don't know how thick that will go. So yeah, the potential is definitely there. One of the things that we're going to happen is I didn't show them in this slide, but there's that Novak collection has 6 foreshafts in it, and we're going to get those x-rayed, and we're going to date all those foreshafts to try to refine that portion of the chronology. I'm not entirely sure what is hafted, what kind of points are hafted on those foreshafts, but when we do the x-ray, we'll hopefully be able to refine some stuff further.
Okay, and I was just curious, would the Untitled Technology be considered an additive technology?
Yeah, no, well, no, that's not. So that's actually, that's a good question. I went rounds on that. No, it's reductive because you're carving. I guess my discussion of the additive is pretty much limited to the baskets and sandals more than that. For the Untitled Technology, that stuff is actually, you're carving those things open, but carving those things. But what's remarkable is how even in that carving, they're just so similar across such a vast area. I mean, Devin Pettigrew, who made the White Dog one, we were able to overlay that over the top of the Spirit Eye one, and I mean, they were almost made on a mold. I mean, they're so similar in dimensions. But no, that's not. That's a good clarifying question. Thank you.
And then lastly, it seems like y'all are doing a lot of incredible work and research through the Center for Big Bend Studies. I'm just curious if there's folks out there who want to, follow the work that y'all are doing. Is there a way they can do that through maybe a journal or some way to keep in touch, a Facebook group or something?
Yeah, we have. We just redesigned our website actually, and our website has. We're always looking for volunteers. We do a whole lot of volunteer activity, and that's kind of as the projects come up. We're always doing more and more research. We have a Facebook page. You can look on Facebook. We have an Instagram page. You can become a member of the center. We put out a annual journal, and we have an annual newsletter that comes out, and we do a conference that focuses on the Trans Pecos every November. So we do those every year.
Great. Well, I do appreciate it. And if any of our viewers have a question for Bryon, feel free to put those in the comment section below.